Boa tarde a todos. Meu nome é
Good
Adriana.
afternoon, everyone. I am Adriana Bauer. I like to welcome you all to this panel. We'll be talking about measure tools for child development in educational policy assessment. We were really looking forward to this panel because we're going to be talking about tools that allow for us to measure how children develop from a number of dimensions and perspectives, cognitive, motor, socio-emotional aspects, and we'll also be looking at public policies. We have two international speakers with us today, Peter Timms, and I'm going to read a short bio, but you have a more complete bio on our website. And we also have Professor Rowena Fair and Marianne Kowinski from Rio de Janeiro. Professor Peter Timms has a grad degree from the University of Cambridge in natural sciences. He has taught in many schools. He's got experience in Central Africa and the northeast of England as well. He was a professor at many institutions. He led a research group in the UK, the RASH user group. He started the PIPS project, the Performance Indicators in Primary Schools, and he researches monitoring, assessment, development, indicators, ADHD, reading and research methodology. And he is going to tell us a little bit about what he's been doing in this past 30 years. I'll be talking about the importance of using these research tools and assessment tools to collect data so that we can form better public policies regarding child education. Professor Rowena Fair is a project leader from OECD. She is responsible for the International Early Learning and Child Wellbeing Study. She is also involved in wider analyses relating to gender, socioeconomic factors, students with migrant backgrounds, and indigenous students in the Australian context mainly. She has experience in the Ministry of Education of Australia, and he has joined the OCDE team to work with this research. She holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Auckland. And we also have Professor Marianne Kowinski. It's an honor to have you here, Professor, as well. She has a PhD in sociology from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She works in the Faculty of Education in Rio de Janeiro, and she coordinates the Laboratory for Research and Educational Opportunities in the University of Rio de Janeiro. And she has been working on research around educational assessment, public policies analyses. She speaks about socio-spatial segregation and education inequalities as well. All of these points have been very important to this ABAVI conference this year. She also coordinates the Research Committee 17 in Education and Society and Brazilian Sociology group. I'm going to be moderating this panel with these three distinguished speakers that we have with us. And please do send your questions so that we can have a question and answer session and answer them at the end. Now, I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Peter Timms, and I'll also be assisting you in keeping track of time so that we can listen to all our speakers. And then we will have our roundtable at the end of the presentation of the three speakers. And I'm sure this is going to be a very fruitful afternoon for us all. All right. So Professor Timms, you may begin, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you everybody for inviting me to this tour, to this session here, which I hope will be of interest to everyone. I'm going to switch on my PowerPoint and try to get that running to see that it's working. So, can you see that? I'm going to assume that you can then.
Yes, it's very good.
Okay. Thank you. So 30 years, yes, I'll come to that in a minute. And I'm going to start here. Although you've heard a bio read out there, I thought I would just say just a few words about something of my origins. So basically, I am a chemistry teacher, started work in Africa many years ago, and spent a long time in the classroom teaching secondary school pupils before moving to university and discovering that there was an opportunity to track children's progress, to track their progress. And so I spent quite a lot of time on creating assessments with good psychometric properties, that's good reliability, predictive validity, and in also setting up monitoring projects so that other people can use those assessments and help watch their children progress through their system. So this project here, I'm going to talk specifically about one particular project that I worked on called the IPIPS project that I am still working on and that other people are working on as well. That's an international education monitoring project, and it's a focus on children when they start school and then with their progress during that first year at school. If we're doing that kind of study, then it's based on samples, so that we would take a country or a city and select to be representative a group of schools, and within the schools take pupils who are representative of their schools. So it's a sample-based way. An alternative way is to make sure that everybody is assessed, and that would be if we were doing it for teachers and so on. So that means we would get information there about pupils, schools, districts, and also about the country level. The data can be used in the schools for their own diagnosis to see about how their pupils are progressing, and in particular, how their pupils are progressing compared to similar children elsewhere. So it's a very powerful way of looking at children's progress. So let's think about the structure of children's growth in the system. And right at the beginning, we have conception and growth in the womb. Then they're moving into a kind of home environment or perhaps into a preschool environment, then into school at different ages around the world, and then eventually, we hope, into the world of work. So what we're talking about here is one little bit right at the beginning of starting school and then 1 year later. But it's a crucial bit because it's a progression from that home environment or a preschool environment into the more formalized settings of schools. But let me just say something about that origin there, because in education, we often don't talk about that early beginning of children in the womb. And at that time, it's absolutely vital that the pregnant mother is looked after and has a healthy life. If that mother is stressed because of what's happening in the home, because of what's happening in the community, then that mother's stress can be imparted onto the growth of the fetus and even the size of the head. If there's drink involved, alcohol, if there's smoking, if there's other poisons in the environment, that baby can be damaged forevermore. And we see things like ADHD as an increase if you've got drink in there. So looking after precursors to that are vital. But when we start school, we want to know where the children are, because then we want to be able to teach them and take them forward from that particular point. So what should we collect from children in some monitoring project? Well, from the children themselves, I suggest that we need to know about their early maths, their early reading, and their language development. One-to-one assessments, teacher to child or assessor to child. We want to know about their physical development. We want to know what they think about school. Do they like going to school? Do they like their teachers? From the teachers, we like to collect data that we can't collect directly from the children, something about how they relate to other children. By assessing one child, we can't know that. We need to observe them over a time, and the teacher is ideally placed to collect that kind of data. Also, the behavior of the child. What's that behavior like? And there are ratings that we would use. Then from the parents, we'd love to know about the background they're coming from and what the home is like. Difficult to get it, but if we can get it, it's great. And also, if the behavior is different at home, we'd like to know that as well as what's happening at school. Then from the districts, that's from the local authorities, we also want to collect data in any large system. We'd like to know, well, what kind of curriculum is being followed there, what kind of schools are they, what are the qualifications of the teachers, and so on. Let me take an example of assessing maths with young children. Amazingly, children are actually born able to do mathematics. It's been shown that little children can count 3 objects, and if one's gone, they know before they can talk. It's inbuilt in them, innate, as it is in some animals. So if we say to a child, here are 3 balls, if I took one away, how many would there be? I know that practically every child in the world can answer that question. We've assessed about 5 million children using this particular assessment, so I'm on confident ground here, provided they have understood the question. Now, they would go through a series of stages of bigger numbers and right up to the 10s, 20s, and then maybe they'd learn some formal arithmetic. And the highest level that we might ask would be a question like that, which practically no children starting school can do. But some can, and if we're a teacher, we should know that. So what we do is to go through a kind of ladder of items, getting harder and harder and harder. And if the children start to falter and get them wrong, we stop that and move on to something else. I thought it might be nice just to share with you an assessment that we've been using for physical development. This is coordination, strength, and so on. It's an assessment known across the world, developed in Rio. And here's what we do. We ask the child from standing just to sit down and then to stand up again. And we start with 10 points. And every time you touch your knee with your hands or lose your balance or touch something else, you lose a point. And that's been used extensively throughout Brazil with young children. And there's some interesting stuff that Marianne might be talking about later on. But it's a quick, easy scale. Most children can do it easily, but some can't. And that's something to worry about. So where have we been collecting the data that I'm going to be talking about, or am talking about? Well, there's a map, and you can see that nice red star over Brazil. I'm working in Florida at the moment. We're collecting some data in Mexico, also in England, Scotland, of course, and other parts of Europe. Russia's a big project for us. We finished one recently in South Africa. Lesotho, I'll share with that in a minute, a little bit there in Malawi, United Arab Emirates, China, proving to be not easy to do that, with the government producing new rules almost, it seems to me, every year, and changing the way the world is. And of course, in Australia and New Zealand. I thought I would share with you a picture of a class in Lesotho where we collect data. Lesotho's one of the poorest countries in the world. It's completely surrounded by South Africa, and it's on the top of a mountain with a king. And you see here a class of about 60. They can have 100 children in a class starting school. And you notice that the teacher is well wrapped up. This is a mountainous kingdom, and even though it's Africa, it's pretty chilly. But those kids are keen, and those kids are learning, and they start off with pretty good maths and reading. So when should we collect the data? There are really 2 possibilities here. One is to say, we're going to collect the data when they're all 4 years old, or 5 or 6 by age. Or we could say, all at the beginning of grade 1. In our case, we're saying, let's go at the beginning of starting school. And I want to just say something about why that is. but also why we would collect it 1 year later. And that double collection of data, which is unusual in international projects with PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, they're all collected at one time. So you can't see progress and you can't see the impact of schooling. But by collecting it twice, you can see that both of those things. Well, if you do at the start of the year, there is a disadvantage. The children are very different ages. At the minimum, they're going to be about a year difference between the youngest and the oldest. And some, it can be 2 years or more, as some people send their children early to school and some people keep them back later. And you would see that in many countries of the world. Also, some countries start at 4, some at 5, some at 6, some at 7, some don't have a specified age. But there are big advantages that when they're at school, we've got them. We know who they are. We can assess them. If we pick another age, maybe it's difficult to find them or even to know if they exist. And here's the key thing. Once you go to school, it can make one massive difference to the attainment and the progress that children make. It really can transform what they're about and what they're doing. So for those reasons, we go for the beginning of school and the end of school. And that makes sometimes comparisons difficult, but comparisons are very difficult anyway, especially when you've got different languages, different cultures, different ways of working, maybe different ways to learn to read. Could we compare children reading Portuguese with reading Chinese and so on? So comparisons are difficult, but sometimes possible. Well, who should collect the data? Well, if possible, in an ideal project, we would have independent assessors and going to collect the objective measures. That's the one of early reading, early maths, and vocabulary, and so on. To collect some of the other data, of course, we need the teachers there because those teachers know those children. And the advantage is that those teachers have seen other children. So getting the teachers to rate them is important, but we need to know that some will be harsh, some will be lenient, some will be unreliable. I'm pleased to say that all those are a bit on the negative side, but actually teachers are pretty good at rating their children. If we ask them things that we could expect them to know, we wouldn't want to ask them something that they don't know about. So we wouldn't ask them about their physical development unless we'd actually part of what the curriculum, what they were learning. That would be a silly thing to do. And it's good to collect data from parents. I mean, they know their children. My goodness, they know their children better than anyone else. But it's sometimes difficult to get hold of those parents, especially in poor situations, I have found in parts of the world. But if you can get them, that's very good to do it. So there's sometimes a poor response rate, and sometimes it's biased to particular groups. And if you ask them how their children are doing, it's hard for a parent to say that their child isn't very good at something. And getting an independent view is difficult. And you know, what happens in the home is absolutely crucial. There are some studies that have really gone into homes and watched what's happening. But if you ask the parents about things in the home, that's difficult for them to give you an honest, objective view of what's going on in the home. And the children, if you ask them, well, they're too young starting school to do it. Really, you need children of secondary school age to be able to give you reliable and valuable information. Just give you one example here from home. It's clear that in homes where they plan to do something and then do it, it's a good thing. So as the children are going to sleep, we're going to say to them, tomorrow we're going to visit your auntie and then we're going to the beach. You wake up the next morning and they do it, or they don't. In families and homes where they plan it and then do it and then maybe talk about it later, that's where you've got the best impact on the children. But if you ask the parents, if you do that, you probably wouldn't get very good answers to it. How should the data be collected? Well, one good way for this is to use a computer or a tablet. The children are answering questions. We've tried to get the children themselves to operate the computer or the tablet and to use voices, but we haven't been successful so far. But recording it is absolutely vital. Then you don't have to transcribe it. You don't got the errors. Data can be transferred easily. We've used also a smartphone, so where you've got a booklet with the child and then somebody's using a smartphone to record the answers and the software on the smartphone to say what you should do next. Or on paper. I've got one paper there, it should be on paper. Or on paper, and that's what we did traditionally, and that's a good way to do that. And we're doing that in Lesotho at the moment, where there's a shortage of software and internet connections and so on. And also by interview. So we might want to interview the parents, we might want to interview the children, and where we do that, we might want to collect the data on the phone, so that by interviewing either face-to-face on the phone and then recording the answers electronically is also a good way to collect the data. Well, I thought that I would share with you a couple of examples that, you could imagine that over many years, I've done many things, produced many reports, as have all the people working on these projects that I put up on that map earlier, together with several PhDs on this. So there's an enormous amount of data and results. And of course, one of the key things here is the variation between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, and between the rich countries and the poor countries. Let's not forget, though, there are children in very poor situations who do extraordinarily well. And we've seen that both in Russia and in South Africa. We've seen children starting at a particularly low level because they're in a rural circumstances in Russia, or because they're in a township, a bit like a favela in South Africa, starting very low, but a year's teaching brings them right up to everyone else, and sometimes in excess of that. So that schooling can make a massive difference to the inequality in that situation. And we've just going through COVID, where the reverse has happened. We've removed the schooling, and lo and behold, we see that the inequalities increase. Schooling is a great leveler. It doesn't make it completely flat and everybody equal, but my goodness, it makes a difference. Well, we want to look at data, and I'm going to share with you two ways in which we've looked at the data. So one is what I've called a reading ladder coming out from South Africa. And you can see there a ladder going up the page. At the ground level, you've got people who know what reading is, or know their letter name, but no more. The next level, they would know the letters and can write their name. At the next level, they would read words or easy sentences. Next one up, they would actually read sentences. And finally, they read with understanding. That seems to be the pinnacle of where we're aimed to, and we'd call it literacy. And you can see the percentages down the right-hand side of children starting school in South Africa. Very few actually reading text, but almost everyone knowing what writing is and reading is, and quite a lot knowing letters. The interesting thing is to look at it after 1 year, and then the progress that's made there. And we've done a similar thing when it comes to moving up in mathematics. We haven't done a similar thing in vocabulary or language development. That's proved to be tougher, especially when you're working with different languages. We were working in South Africa in the Western Cape, that's near Cape Town, and there they've got 3 languages. They're speaking their English, Afrikaans, and isiXhosa. I think if I try to say it as the locals would say it, they're Osha. That's a click language. I can't do it properly, but you get the idea. I think if 2 countries are to compare one another, then South Africa with Brazil is quite a good way to look. Enormous inequality and groups of people traditionally herded into particular areas. And finally, I thought I would share with you this chart of children starting school with scores from Australia, England, New Zealand, and Scotland. Along the bottom axis, you've got the age of the children, starting at just 4 and going up to the age of 6 1/4. And up the left-hand side, we've got the score on a maths test. The red dots show the scores in England by every quarter year. So 4 years, 4 1/4, 4 1/2, 4 3/4, 5. And you can see that the older the child, the higher on average their math score is. Then the black ones are the ones from Scotland. They start school a year, 6 months later. So they're higher up, but they're in line for what you'd expect for their age. And right in the middle, I don't know if you can see that, there's one little purple dot here. That's for New Zealand, and that's only on one age group, because when we're collecting those data, those children were all starting at the same age. So it's, you're 5 years old, happy birthday, go to school. So the children are coming into school in increasing numbers throughout the year, and as soon as they come in, they get assessed. You can see in Australia, one state territory, another state territory, and you can see the age for age that a higher score when they're starting, and one might wonder what they were doing in their preschool that they weren't doing in England and the rest. And of course, that shows a difference. And then the key question is, what happens to them after that? Well, I believe I've had my time, and I thank you, and I look forward to the questions later. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Teens, for bringing to us this so amazing data. And I think we can go directly to Rowena and Mariani, and also in the end we will have time to talk about the speeches and make questions. Okay, Dr. Rowena.
Okay, thank you. I'll just. Sorry. Hold on. Okay. Sorry about that. Right. So just hang. Okay. Right. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and participate in this session. Can everyone see the screen okay? And you can hear me. So yes, my name is Rowena Fair. I'm from the OECD, and I'm going to talk about a study that we have been doing on children's early learning. And I really want to thank and acknowledge Peter and his team. Have paved so much of the way, I think, internationally in terms of early years assessment. We've taken a slightly different approach, and I'll talk about that on the way through. At the OECD, there are a number of things that we're trying to achieve and that we advise governments very strongly. One is to put an increasing focus on children's early years. That is because the early years are so critical for children, for their well-being and for their success in school and beyond. So governments often focus on schooling years and post-schooling years, and our advice to them is to also put a great deal of attention on children's early years. We also encourage governments to use reliable, valid data to monitor progress, monitor outcomes, and to monitor the outcomes that matter, the areas that matter most for children, both in terms of their current well-being and in terms of what happens next. And I know that the conference has a focus on inequality, and I will talk about what we found as we go through. But you know, we see there is as much difference within systems as there are across systems. You know, as Peter said, there are, even within rich countries, there are children who are in impoverished circumstances who do not have the kind of educational opportunities that other children have. So we encourage countries to focus on differentiating outcomes within their systems, as well as looking at, you know, averages that, say, PISA provide, because those averages can hide a lot of what's really going on for particular groups children. So today, what I want to do is share some of the findings from the OECD study on 5-year-olds, the International Early Learning and Child Wellbeing Study, or IELTS, as it's called. Now, that is 5-year-olds, and we chose 5-year-olds because countries wanted something that was directly comparable. At 5 years of age, across most countries, children, almost all children, are in early childhood education and care or in very early schooling, so we can access them. The study does focus on children's holistic development. We know that a broad range of outcomes at this age group is a better predictor of later life outcomes and child wellbeing than if we focused on a narrow or academic set. We also look at children's home environment. We know that at home at 5 years of age, a home is the most influential factor, and many countries actually have in place policies and programs to support families, to support parents, to provide the best home learning environment that they can for their children. But we also look at children's participation in early childhood education and care, and the nature, the intensity, and so on of that participation. What I will do next is just draw out some of the findings in relation to gender and socioeconomic disadvantage. There are other areas in terms of inequalities, but I think those two are probably as much as I can cover in the time. But of course, our material is on the website, and you're very welcome to go and look and see at the other areas of other findings. So I talked about, we looked at social emotional skills, we look at cognitive skills. In social emotional skills, we do look at a number of areas: empathy, trust. I've got their pro-social skills, but that's capturing a number of areas such as curiosity, children's confidence, their sociability, and their non-disruptive behaviour. So there were 6 domains of social emotional development. We do have a direct assessment of children's empathy, and we have indirect assessments of the remaining, well, actually of all 6. And then between the two, between cognitive and social emotional development, we also assess children's self-regulation, which has a strong cognitive element, but it also has an emotional element of emotional control as well. The assessment.
Sorry, Professor, we're really struggling to understand you. Could you try and speak up a bit?
Okay, yes, I will.
Thank you very much. If you want to repeat the past slide, I missed half of it. I'm really sorry to tell you.
Oh, okay. So we look at social emotional skills as well as cognitive skills. In social emotional skills, we look at empathy, trust, as well as a set of skills that I've termed pro-social skills. They include curiosity, confidence, sociability, and non-disruptive behaviour. We also look at children's skills on self-regulation, their ability to control their emotions, to sustain attention. So that has a cognitive element and a social emotional element. Is that better? Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
Yes, that's much better, much better. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the assessment is the direct assessment is undertaken on a tablet via stories, games, and other activities that they're developmentally appropriate for children, specifically developed for this assessment. They're fun, children enjoy them, and often actually at the end, children ask if there's any more. So they're designed for children to be a good experience for children. There is no reading or writing. The reason for that is our analysis of longitudinal data showed that oral language skills are more predictive and more comparable across countries than focusing on reading and writing. Children learn to read and write at different ages in different countries. So we have focused on those predictive skills that are comparable across different education systems, different cultural and linguistic settings. Each child is supported on a one-to-one basis by a trained study administrator. They're 5 years old. They actually can, the children, the tablet exercises are highly intuitive. It's touch screen. The 5-year-olds are really comfortable. They enjoy it. But there's study administrators there just to make sure everything is going okay. And we had no difficulties with the 5-year-olds just navigating their way through the exercises. We also asked the children their views. So Peter talked about this, and it is very important. So we asked the children about their early learning environments, what they enjoy doing, who they like playing with. We also asked them what they want to do or be when they grow up, so that we hear from the children themselves about their perspectives on their life and their learning environment. Of course, we collect information from the children's parents. As I agree with Peter, parents know their children best and can provide a wealth of information that is helpful to, along with the teachers' reports, triangulate the assessment. So we have the direct assessment, information from parents, and information from teachers. And they are different, they are different because the children are in a different setting in the ECC centre or at school compared to being at home. We were very fortunate that we had very positive response rates from parents and from teachers, so we were able to include their ratings in the study findings, which means that the data is highly reliable. We got incredible participation rates actually, and at first they were so high that I've been involved in research for a long time. They were so high that I thought they were in error and sent the team back several times to check. And then in fact, I went out into the field myself and I asked teachers, why are you participating? Why are you happy to participate in this study? Because we're asking for your time. And the teachers said to us, this area, this age group is so important. And we want governments to know about how children are doing at this age. We want people, the general community, to know how important, how critical it is these early years. So we thought that was interesting, but we were very appreciative that the teachers were so willing to participate. The main findings of the first iteration of the study were released last year. So the study was initially piloted in 3 countries, the United States, England, and Estonia. And as I said, these are available on our website, and we have been continuing to analyse the data, but I'll give you some of the high-level findings. So what we found in terms of socio-economic disadvantage, so comparing children from the poorest homes, the bottom quartile, and those from the highest quartile. We see, particularly in the cognitive skill domain, gaps of up to 1 year of development difference. So remember, these children are 5 years of age. So the children from more advantaged families are 1 year ahead already of children from disadvantaged families. The effects of, or the associations with socioeconomic disadvantage were stronger than based on those differences based on gender, but nonetheless, we still saw that there were gender differences in favour of girls in emergent literacy, so that's their oral language skills, and across the board on social emotional skills. The things that seem to make a difference for children, including children from low socioeconomic backgrounds, attending early childhood education and care. Now, in England and Estonia, almost all children attend some kind of ECC environment, but this is not the case in the United States. So we were able to see clearly the difference between children who had been and who had not had the opportunity to go to ECC. In the United States, whether you participate in ECC relates a lot to your family's circumstances. So children from more advantaged backgrounds are more likely to go, and they benefit in relation to other children from advantaged backgrounds. But for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, they're less likely to go. But you can see that those that do have a real step up. You can see that difference that attending ECC makes for those children, and across the board, not just cognitive skills, but also things like their confidence levels and so on. If we look at the home environment, we had a comprehensive questionnaire for parents that we were confident gave us accurate information, and we see that for children, even from the poorest homes where their parents read to them regularly, with them regularly, that engage them in back and forth conversations, that are involved in the child's ECC or school, we see that those children do better again across the board, both in their cognitive development, their literacy, emergent literacy and numeracy, and in their social emotional skills. So we also looked at device use. So 4 out of 5 of the 5-year-olds regularly use an iPhone or some other digital device. We did not find a strong negative or positive relationship between the use of technology and the children's development. Although at the extremes, there were some impacts, and you can imagine the displacement effect of where children were using devices a lot every day. Clearly, they're not talking to their parents, they're not playing with other children, so they're missing out on things that would support their development. And we did find a strong relationship between children's social emotional development and their cognitive development. So those two types of skills were related and mutually reinforcing. So just looking again at the size, the magnitude of the gap based on socioeconomic background, 70 points is about 1 year of development. So you can see that the greatest gap, if you like, is in emergent numeracy. The gaps are smaller for social emotional skills, but nonetheless, they're still there. So again, I emphasize these children are 5 years old, and when they're facing a 1 year gap between the most advantaged and the least advantaged, what this clearly shows us that if there's a clear message that if countries want to mitigate disadvantage, they need to start before children arrive at school, that those ECC settings are so critical for those children, but also support for families, parenting programs and so on. I talked about gender differences. So again, if you think about 70 points being about 1 year of development, there were differences in favour of girls in emergent literacy and across the board for social emotional skills, but the size of those differences is smaller. You can see that in the pro-social behaviour, empathy, non-disruptive behaviour, they're stronger. I'm just conscious of time. We asked the children what they wanted to do or be when they grew up, and most children had a pretty clear idea of what they wanted to do. And what we see here is a slightly different picture, because we see greater effects in relation to gender than we do on the basis of socioeconomic status. So particularly for boys, they were very likely to opt for what we would term a traditionally male occupation. So 1 in 2 boys, every second boy would choose an occupation that is currently male dominated, whereas 1 in 4 girls would choose an occupation that is currently female dominated. There were some differences based on socioeconomic status, but only amongst the boys, not amongst the girls. So, for example, boys from the least advantaged families were more likely to opt for being truck drivers or being in the armed forces, whereas boys from high socioeconomic backgrounds were more likely to opt to be pilots or doctors. So, yeah. So these are 5 years old, and half the boys are already seeing what is, we would call I'm just highlighting teachers because I think they're so important and interesting about what children see as desirable. So what is next for us is we have more publications on that we're preparing now. One is, I think, a really interesting one on what children enjoy most about their learning environments. It's very insightful from 5-year-olds' perspective. We're doing a piece on risk and resilience. And we're now inviting countries to join the second cycle of the study. So we've demonstrated how it works and what we're able to find out. So now we're inviting other countries to join. And we certainly hope that Brazil, along with other countries, will consider doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowena. We already have questions, but now I think we can pass to Mariane, and in the end we will have the debate. Please, Mariane. Thank you, Rowena.
Então, boa tarde para todo mundo. Eu queria começar.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Perfeito, Mariane.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, Mariane. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Abavi, for inviting me. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a member of this great panel. It is a great pleasure to be here with Peter and Rowena. And I'm going to present to you today part of our research, which has been developed since 2017 in our laboratory for educational research, which is coordinated by me and Professor Bartolo from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And we are going to draw a lot from what Peter presented. So I believe that Peter has already talked a great deal about a part of what I was going to say in my presentation. And I had the chance to participate in another panel 4 years ago when we were just starting this research. So it is a great pleasure to be here again, presenting the results and our findings over the past 5 years. Our research focuses on preschool, but I would like to talk about the origin of our study and what motivated us to begin this study. And this has a lot to do with what Rowena and Peter have said. We have a lot of studies that have been designed. They are longitudinal studies showing the importance of preschool or the first year of schooling for children's development and their school journey as a protective factor for disadvantaged children, especially when early childhood education, when we have high quality early childhood education. Here in Brazil, we have been investing and expanding early childhood education with a number of policies, including ECEC in our mandatory fund for education here, so that we can improve the physical conditions of ECEC. We are expanding from 64% in coverage in 2001 to almost universal coverage, 94% coverage of children attending preschool here in Brazil. Now, do we have tools to monitor access? We know that access for children from 0 to 3 years of age is very difficult, not so much for older children because coverage is universal. in that age group, but we have tools to monitor some of those aspects. We also have tools to monitor the physical aspects of ECC here in Brazil, but we don't have measures looking at inequalities in development here in Brazil. We have information about primary and secondary education inequalities. We know, for example, that learning inequalities in primary and secondary school, they are increasing, but we don't know what's happening in ECEC. We don't know how these children start schooling, and we don't know the impact of expanding ECEC. Here in Brazil, we have a very good situation in which we have almost all of our children attending school, but we don't have the information about the impact of that on inequalities. We can see inequality very well when children are 10, but we don't have that information for when they just start school. We don't have the information about the impact of ECC policies. I'm going to talk in this presentation very briefly about our longitudinal study. We are still conducting this study using the tools, the instruments that Peter presented to us in his speech. And then I'm going to talk about what we have learned about educational inequalities in the beginning of the preschool period and throughout preschool. And then I'm going to talk about what we have learned about school factors that are associated to learning and decreasing inequalities, which are important for policies here in Brazil that are targeted at ECC. And towards the end of my presentation, if I have time, I am going to talk about feedback, the feedback that we provide to our education departments, and also principals and teachers that participated in our study. So let's talk about what our study is like. We use 3 independent samples involving public and private schools in 2 municipalities, a large one in the Northeast and a medium-sized one in the Northeast and a large one in the Southeast region. So we included 123 schools with 4,800 children. So this is the design of our study. We assess children in terms of physical aptitude and cognitive development in the beginning of the first year of preschool when they are 4, and then at the end of the first preschool year. And at the same time, we assess children in the second year of preschool, in the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. So this is the design that we have been using, with the exception of one sample in which we applied 3 consecutive measures from the beginning all through the end of preschool. We used instruments to assess cognitive skills in language and mathematics, behavior, and personal, social, emotional development. And they are instruments adapted from the ones that Peter presented. And we also used an instrument for a physical aptitude, which Peter presented. And we also collected contextual background measurements based on questionnaires answered by parents, and information about school inputs and materials, the types of offers, school policies, school practices based on questionnaires for teachers and principals, and also about the quality of interactions. In one of our samples, we were able to conduct classroom observations. So what have we learned about inequalities at the beginning of preschool? And I'm going to give you one example about one district that we studied, and we saw a strong association between SCS in the beginning of schooling. And we also compared different districts, and we saw that the inequalities are different and they can increase, decrease, or be maintained depending on the district. I'm going to give you one example from one district. This is a municipal district, and when children start school, and I'm not really talking about quartiles here, I'm talking about one standard deviation above the average or below the average. So we are talking about extremes here. And we saw that in this district, the children at the extremes already have inequality that accounted for 5 to 6 months. And after 1 year, that inequality, that gap increased to 7 to 8 months. So in the beginning, we already had a 5 to 6 months gap, and that increased. And that didn't happen in all schools. Within the district, the gaps were smaller in some schools and bigger in others, but on average, there was an increase in all of them. And in other districts, the gaps initially were higher, and sometimes they didn't increase over time. So it's what Peter and Rowena said. What happened before children got to school makes a massive difference. So cross-sector policies from the very point where the women get pregnant and to the moment where children start education, school education, it all makes a great difference. And those policies can contribute to not increasing gaps throughout preschool. In the same city, we have a different comparison here, which is not common based on our education data. We don't often see that comparison because we don't have data that are representative of the city. This is a comparison between public and private schools. Around 30% of children attended private schools and 70% attended public schools. And we can see that the gap here is larger. So in the beginning of the school journey, the gaps are about 7 to 8 months in cognitive development. And after 1 year, that gap can reach almost the level that Rowena said at the age of 5 years. It's almost 1 year, a 1 year difference between the ones attending public schools and children attending private schools in one single city. We are not talking about cross-country inequalities here. And here we have some other issues that we observed in our study. The home learning environment can also explain that starting point. If we control for socioeconomic status, the activities developed at home, such as reading and games with numbers and rhymes and letters, that is associated with the starting point, but also the development of children throughout preschool. And this is in line with other international studies. And the same thing happens here in Brazil, according to our study. And as Rowena said, the socioeconomic status cannot be addressed with educational policies, but the learning environment at home can. We can have policies addressing that, and we can also have policies for schools to support parents. Another point that we observed in our study is absenteeism. We see children missing school consistently, and we realize that that is related to children's development. So we can offer school participation to everybody with great teacher and great equipment. But if children are not attending school consistently, we are not going to see the desired effect. So that also helps us think about the reasons, and we investigated those reasons so that we can design policies targeted at decreasing the number of children missing school frequently. Another point that we saw, which is also in line with what Peter and Rowena said, is that cognitive development is strongly associated with motor development and physical aptitude and social emotional skills. I'm not going to present you the results, but later we are going to have a session here at our conference with 2 students, and they are going to present those data points to you. And now I'm going to talk about some of these school factors that we understand that are associated with children development. There are 3 aspects that are very interesting. There is a constant association between the size of classes and children's learning, with a moderating effect for SES. We also saw an association between the type of offer at the school and children's learning, with a moderating effect for the point of entry. And we also saw an association between the quality of interactions and the gains in cognitive development throughout preschool. And a side note here, in general, international literature emphasizes more the quality of processes and interactions, but we used a very specific instrument, which is class. And according to other studies, the institutional support is the dimension that is mostly associated with children's development, but we didn't see that correlation so much in the district that we assessed. We had a result that was just below the threshold, score of 3, and we didn't see much variation across the classes that we assessed in this particular district. Now to break down the results a little bit, here we have the data from one of the districts that we studied, and we can see a global effect in the effect size of minus 0.23. That means that in a class with 16 children and 1 teacher, and a class with 28 children, and that is a real variation. In the district, we had classes with 30 children and others with 15 children. So this is not hypothetical. This is actually what we saw on the field.
So when we look at classes with 28 students, they are learning 3 months less than smaller classes. But this size of classes was particularly damaging to lower socioeconomic family students. Another finding, and this was common to all of the samples we looked at, was has to do with the type of offer, what is available. And we're talking about 2 types of preschool. One is where you only have child education, children from 0 to 5 years of age, and other schools where you have elementary school alongside child education. So you have, when you have only child education, you have schools that are configured, set specifically for those children. You have training that is specific for teachers for those children. And what we notice is that this boosted child development. With this type of offer, with this type of points available, we could see that children learned faster than those that were attending integrated schools. And in these cases, it was particularly beneficial to children with a lower starting point, children that started school with a lower cognitive level of development. So these schools boosted them further. So these are points that are really interesting for us to take into account when we think about public policies and what we want when we think about public education in Brazil. We can learn from our experiences. And these results have been thoroughly discussed with the districts where the studies were carried out. We had lengthy dialogues with the departments of education of those regions. And another important aspect of this study that was interesting was the feedback to schools. So schools that took part in the surveys and studies, well, we collected data, we put together reports that were very much inspired in reports that are generated in England, and we showed what the purposes of the research was, what the study aimed to do, and the setting of the schools and the children, and the development of the children in the first year at school. So we had reports for the classes and reports for the schools, and we had workshops and sessions with teachers and headmasters to help them understand those reports and to help them think about how they could use these data in pedagogical planning. And this is very much related to the rungs that Peter was showing in his presentation, the ladder. So we see the class here, and we could see that in preschool, this teacher had this number of children in the, or this breakdown. You had 5 children at the starting level, So they were starting to understand what mathematics was, what's bigger, what's smaller, plus and minus. We had most children, half of the class, already able to identify numbers from 1 to 5 and to count some objects. And we had 7 students that could work from 6 to 10 and to have simple calculations. And at the end of the year, we only had 1 child on the first level, 10 in the second level, and then we had more children at more advanced levels, so 11 and 3, and levels 3 and 4. And this type of activity, the reports, the workshops, this is something that teachers really liked, and they were not reluctant at all to participate or do it. They looked at the reports and workshops and they understood that that information, those data were useful for them. And then we had studies that monitor those schools, and then teachers were showing us what they did with the information we supplied them with. So that was quite interesting. And we also attribute part of this acceptance to the fact that we actually only showed the school results to the headmaster, and then the classes results specifically only to the teachers in classes. So you didn't have them comparing themselves to one another. So we had teachers, we saw the teachers really took this information and these reports really well. So what did we learn? We believe that using these tools really helped us produce evidence that is important for public policies, decisions and planning, and also for school planning, so that we all know what the starting point was and how the children develop in that first year, understanding the school and non-school related aspects and the socioeconomic background. All of that was important for these discussions with the departments of education and with the schools. So we believe that it's important that these studies continue to be carried out in Brazil. And the next steps, well, we are developing a study around the impact of the pandemic on children. So we carried out this study in 2019, so we know how children developed in certain districts and schools in 2019, and now we're comparing the development in 2021 and in 2020 to that. Children in the same age bracket. And we want to show the impact of the pandemic on cognitive development and the physical aptitude of children at school, and the impact of the pandemic on educational inequalities. I'm not going to be presenting any studies here today, but I'm going to be presenting these studies at another event next week. And this event will be focusing on the effects of the pandemic in the first childhood and first infancy. And we will be looking at that on the 7th of October. And that's it. Thank you very much for having me. I'm open for questions. Thank you very much, Mariana. I'd like to see if you can please put the link or any information about this event you just mentioned next week. If you can put that in the chat box so that we can send it to other people. So I'd like to thank the 3 speakers. I'll be speaking Portuguese here, and we'll be counting on our interpreters for the translation. So we'd like to thank the 3 speakers. The 3 presentations showed us very interesting results for us to discuss. We have a few questions popping up, and I'll start off with a question I'm going to start off with a question that I was thinking about, and that's to Dr. Timms and to Mariane, specifically because the both of you spoke of adapting tools and instruments, right? So Dr. Timms spoke about adapting tools, and that can be an issue. Countries are different when it comes to the curriculum, when it comes to the age at which children start school, and And the curricula are also very different. And the way the curricula are organized is also very different. So I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Timms. How is it that we should instruct countries when it comes to adapting these tools? And I'd like to ask Mariane what you took into account when you were adapting these tools to the Brazilian context and setting. So just for us to get started, and on top of these questions, I believe that the questions were translated. Dr. Timms, can you say that you heard the translation, please?
Okay. I've got the translation. I heard what you said. Interesting question. I think of all the international projects, the OECD and the IAEA have spent a long time dealing with adaptation of instruments. If I just give you a kind of feel for what we would do, something that's easiest for us is dealing with the mathematics. So if we want to count 5 objects, it's easy to ask that in almost any language, and the translation is straightforward, but we would expect it to be translated once and then back translated or translated independently by 2 people, compared, adjusted, translated back and compared with the original, and then adjustments made. So sometimes, as I said, in mathematics, that's pretty straightforward. But there are some occasions where you simply can't do it. So one that is almost impossible, we are interested in children's ability to rhyme or pick out rhyming words. It's an indication of later difficulties in reading. It's a dyslexia indicator. So in English, we'd have a word like eel, feel, deal, wheel, and they all rhyme together, and we can produce a test based on rhyming words. But can I translate that into Portuguese? No way, nor into Spanish, nor into anything else. So you have to start again and say, well, I want to assess rhyming in Portuguese. You must create that yourself. So some things are straightforward, some things are hard, and in some cases, it's already been done. So we're interested in children's behavior on attentiveness, hyperactivity, and so on. And we've been using the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-4 to do it. And that has already been translated into most languages around the world. Or there are some European projects which have produced behavior and mental health and well-being, which have been translated into the languages of Europe. So sometimes we can build on what other people do. Sometimes it's straightforward, and sometimes it's impossible. Let me just pick up another 2 points there before I leave it for others. The curriculum is different. Yes, that's true. But you know, if you take young children, they develop very similarly throughout the world. Later on, as they get up to pre-university, they're all doing different stories, but those young children are all developing language. They're all developing early maths. They're all learning to count. They're learning to use symbols. And so the curriculum isn't dominating what we want. And working in the United States, I discovered that they do some things that we don't do in the Florida curriculum. Well, okay, they're small things, but you need to acknowledge them and put in assessments for those. But most of it is straightforward. And of course, children start at reach different levels. So in different countries, you would start at a low level, in another country at a high level. And sometimes you make a mistake, so that in Russia, the preschools are forbidden by law from teaching children to read. And so our assessments for those children age 6 and beyond, it just started at pre-reading. But we discovered very quickly that 90% of them can read when they start school. Somebody was teaching them and nobody really knew about it. So, so there's some complications and some answers. Over to someone else.
Thank you, Dr. Timms. Mariane, você quer comentar?
Mariane, would you like to talk about what you took into account for Brazil? Yes, I'll just talk about it briefly.
Well, first of all, there are challenges related to adaptation, but I think that we struggle more with what Peter said, comparisons. Comparisons are tougher because there are difficulties related to adaptation. So my impression here in Brazil is exactly what Peter said. For mathematics, it was really easy and straightforward. For languages, it was easier in the beginning, but then for rhymes, we had to adapt everything. We should forget everything and start over from scratch. And we also needed pre-testing to see if things were working, if children understood our questions. And our concern is that we were starting in a very specific context in a country with a lower SES, with a population that has lower education and really young children at 4. So our concern was, can this instrument capture all of those variations? So we pre-tested and we understood that children at 4 until the first year of primary education, we were able to assess them with that instrument. And my perception is that this is not a curriculum-based instrument. It has some good predictors for future learning, but if we look at our curriculum, we are going to see many things that are there, for example, vocabulary development or counting. There are many things, many questions there that are present in our curriculum. And we also never state what we expect from children. We didn't say that, we didn't state that in our study, but regardless of that, we can see that there are inequalities and they are associated with socioeconomic background. So we should be concerned about that. Otherwise, they are going to become stronger, and in the future, it would be harder to revert that situation. And I believe that 2 years ago, a study was presented at a conference. I don't know if you were there, Marianne. He was a Brazilian professor who taught at Texas, and he was talking about a study for interventions with the families, asking parents to talk with their children because that's important for vocabulary development. And they conducted a type of survey that was not very common here in Brazil. They tried to record children talking and trying to count how many words they knew. And this is not the type of survey that we conduct traditionally here in Brazil. And he showed the importance of the interventions. And that's why I asked this question. Sometimes we hear about those initiatives, but they are for the English context or the Australian context, but it is also very important for us to understand how the instruments are adapted. So thank you, Dr. Teams and Mariani, for your answers. We have 81 participants in our session. I would like to thank you all very much for being here and encourage you to ask questions. In the meantime, I'm going to read 2 questions by Daniel Aguiar for Rowena.
Digital devices are related with children's physical development? Para você, to Rowena. E a outra é, Rowena mentioned about the 1-year difference in cognitive skills between high and low SES. Can you share any information about how the low SES children catch up longitudinally? Rowena, we would like to hear you.
Okay, on the 1-year gap between the high SES and the lower SES children, from our study, what we can see is that attending high quality early childhood education and care makes a difference. It also makes a difference if there's a strong home learning environment, and that can start at any point. Ideally, it's right at the very beginning. But children are very receptive in those early years to positive interventions, either at family-based interventions or community-based. Children are born curious. We don't have to be taught to be curious. We start curious. It's just what happens to children during the course of their lives. When you look at them at senior secondary school and they don't they're not interested anymore, it's because of what's happened. It's not out. We're innately curious. Children love learning, and if we can provide them with the opportunities to do so. And we're also not, what we're not is we're not all born natural parents. You know, we parent the way that often that we were parented, or what our friends or family do. So, you know, some of us need information about when our children are very, very small. You know, we don't necessarily know that speaking an adult language, a lot of, you know, frequent interaction of complex adult language helps our children to develop, and they will do better, including reading books to children before they understand language. You know, that is important, but we don't necessarily know. So there's a lot that policies can do to support that. Also make a plug for really high quality early schooling. It can make a difference, but if schooling is one size fits all, it's developed for a particular group of children, but not for this group of children, it's not going to help. Children can accelerate. They can make huge gains, but it needs deliberate pedagogy, deliberate planning and resourcing and so on. So on the second question about digital devices and physical development, the England, in fact, in our study, this actually goes to some national adaptation. They have a priority on children's physical development, and they added some additional items on children's physical development. So they were able to see the relationship between device use and physical development. What we found is across the 3 countries, though, actually on physical development, but also on other aspects of child development, we could not see a clear relationship. It depended on what else was going on in the child's life. So if the child had a great home environment, they were in a good ECC or early school setting, they were socially, you know, emotionally stable, everything was going well in their life, use of digital devices didn't seem to make either a positive difference or a negative difference. We did see in cases where children were using devices at the extreme. You know, these are 5-year-olds. So if 5-year-olds are on screen every day for prolonged periods of time, then they're not going to be playing. So they're not going to be developing those physical skills, but they're not going to be developing their language skills, their social skills. It's not, you know, it's a matter of balance. But, you know, digital devices are here to stay. These 5-year-olds, I was surprised at, and the, you know, the ECC centres talk to us about, they make, and say in Estonia, almost all the 5-year-olds have their own phone. Almost all of them, but they hand it in as they arrive at the ECC centre in the morning. They put it in their locker along with their raincoat or their jersey. But that's not necessarily the case in all countries. So interestingly, in the United States, their children are more likely to use devices. More 5-year-olds have their own devices and use them more often than in Estonia. Estonia, you think of Estonia as being, you know, very high tech, and it is, but they're very clear about what children spend their day doing, and it's not being on their phone. It's about playing with other children and doing activities together.
Thank you, Ruina. Thank you very much for your answer. I think we have time just for 2 or 3 more questions because the time of the section. And we have one here. Como os pesquisadores levam...
And the next question is, how do researchers take into account the issues related to the development gaps for children with disabilities? Not only physical disabilities, but also some sort of disorder, for example, ADHD. Do you adapt the instruments or the analysis? How do you do that? And I'm going to add two questions here, one for Mr. Timms. You explained that you present children with blocks of questions, and children are directed to the different questions depending on their answers. And our audience has a member here, Professor Dalton, and I wanted to ask you, what you do is an adaptive test? Is that what you do? Or is it a different logic in the way that you present questions and route children to different questions? And for Rowena, I was very curious as a researcher about how you treat information related to the children's views. Do you collect that information? I was curious. I wanted to know more details about how you treat and process that information, about how you analyze that information. And one last question that I wanted to pose to all three of you. Since our panel is here to discuss the use of these instruments so that we can address inequalities and devise policies to address inequalities, according to the knowledge that you have gathered and according to the research that you have collected, conducted, what are the recommendations that you have for policies, public policies targeted at decreasing inequalities? Because the gaps between low and high SES, that is related to the social structure. And I learned from Professor Michael Young when I was in England, he always talked about the fact that school cannot alone address the structural inequalities of society. So when we look at that massive impact of SES in children development at such an early age, what do you think that we can do in terms of public policies? Because it's such an early age for us to see that determining factor in children. So if you can share a little bit of your experience about that, how do you think public policies can address and really tackle inequality so that we can improve that situation that is so important for us to know more about? And for me, this is a devastating situation, you know, to know that those gaps are so massive at such an early age. Please, thank you.
If I go first, then I'll try to be brief because I think our time is limited, isn't it? So we can't do much. So you've asked big questions there, and I won't be able to answer them. But let me try to be brief and address what I think are the major points. Let me take your last point first, which is what policies should you have? We should direct funds to children in poor circumstances and at pregnant mothers to give them good health for that child that starts with. And we should encourage good teachers to be working in tough circumstances. Quite often around the world, we see that teachers will go to a richer school, they're paid better, they've got smaller classes, it's easier, or with older children. Let's get the good teachers and pay them more to work with young children at an early stage. Let's look after children at home. Let's encourage parenting skills and look after pregnant mothers. And that requires money. I would take that money from the rich people and I would use it with the poor people. But there's a political angle maybe I shouldn't go down. So let me switch to your other question, which was about assessing children who have got some special need. Mm-hmm. And let's say that there are some children for whom the assessments we are talking about can't be used. If a child can't understand the assessment, you can't assess them. Maybe their language is different, maybe they've got visual problems, maybe they've got hearing problems, then you need a specially adapted assessment for them. We've done some of that, but we haven't done all of it. And there are some children that we really shouldn't pretend that we could assess. For the ADHD children, however, in most cases, they can do the assessments. And that isn't a problem. The problem is that their inattentiveness in the classroom needs to be addressed. And there are ways to help the teachers with that. We've written a booklet which has been translated into Portuguese that is available to teachers for free to help them work on that. But it's the assessment of the inattentiveness is by the teacher, and then we have to worry about what we do with it. So I'll stop there for fear that I eat into other people's time.
Okay, thank you. Rowena?
Okay, I'll follow Peter's lead and go the last question first. So where I've seen gaps that you would expect to develop being eliminated really early, it's when there has been community-based holistic support to families that sustained and continued over a number of years. So where the families, the needs of the mother, the family, the child, right from, before day one, addressed, and where the early education needs or the early learning needs, I would say, and development needs of the child are addressed right from that very beginning, where the parents are supported, when there's a huge focus on language development, social emotional development, and that continues seamlessly all the way up to the transition to, highly effective early schooling. And it needs to be community by community. You cannot make a policy at a central level, no matter what country you are. These are people, and it needs to work in that community. So whatever it is needs to be acceptable, preferably staffed by people from that community, trained for that community, reflecting the cultural norms or whatever of that community. It's not a central, well, it can be a central policy to resource it and to support it. In terms of children with disabilities, we didn't exclude children with disabilities from the study. If the parent or the teacher thought that it would be harmful in any way, of course they could be excluded, but we welcome children. We of course noted, parents and teachers told us if there were issues, but we saw children with ADHD. I remember actually observing one of the assessments, because they're on tablet, there's no time restriction, so they can take as long as they like. So they can do a bit, run around, come back, do a bit more, run around again, come back and do a bit more. We didn't need the child to do it in a linear fashion. They weren't sitting in a classroom, they were in a room with a study administrator and one other child, and so it wasn't a problem. In terms of children's views, we take children's verbatim views, thousands of them, and translate those that we need to translate, say from Estonian, Russian and so on, and then code them and analyse them. So the report that we provided, it's called The Future at 5, which is what the 5-year-olds told us they wanted to do or be, when it's all based on verbatim. And if you go into that report, I put a lot of quotes from the children's voices themselves, and we're doing that the same thing with what children enjoy most about their ECC centre or school.
Thank you so much. Mariane?
Bora falar rapidinho só para encerrar, né?
I'll just speak very quickly here just to wrap up. So as Rowena and Peter said, I just would like to add that's important that we analyze these initiatives, understand the impact, and see how we can roll out programs so that we can make good decisions and not waste already very scarce resources. In Brazil, children with disabilities, if able to take the test, they participated, and it's also important to see how children with disabilities are developing, of course. We can use the same instrument adapted and see how attention deficit or hyperactivity are behaving as well. And just to answer the question about the test, it is an adaptive test. We have it on a tablet, and it will adapt to the knowledge of the child. And more than that, in the second wave, of assessment, we don't start at the beginning of the test, we start at the point where the child stopped. So it is a shorter test, and that's important for children at this age. Thank you very much, Mariana, for your explanations. I must thank the three of you very much for everything we had this sessions. Thank you, Professor Timms. Thank you, Professor Rowena Fair. Thank you, Adriana Bauer. Thank you, Marianne Kolinsky. So I'd like to end the session here because we need to end it. There will be other sessions coming up. You ended with the feeling that you want more of that, right? And I think this type of discussion is absolutely crucial, especially in the Brazilian setting. You know, child education and monitoring child education and the Brazilian context is very, very important. And I hope that we soon have more opportunities to hear what you have to say and learn more about your work. So thank you very much for your three presentations. Thank you very much to the three speakers. Thank you very much to all of our listeners as well. And I hope that you continue to join us in the coming sessions at the conference. And well, it is an online event, but it still can be very useful for us to learn very much. So thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.